Zoe knew someone had decided her marriage was over before anyone had bothered to tell her, because the first thing she saw inside the Sterling estate was a row of wardrobe boxes labeled with her name. They stood beside the service corridor in perfect order, sealed with cream tape, each one numbered in Margaret's narrow handwriting, as though Zoe's life had been prepared for shipment. Her flight from Chicago had landed early after she secured a scholarship agreement for the Sterling Family Foundation, and she had come home carrying the signed contract and an antique fountain pen for Adrian. Harold opened the front door with an apology already forming in his eyes, while two unfamiliar security guards waited near the west staircase, pretending not to watch her. When Zoe asked what was happening, he lowered his voice and said, "Lady Margaret expected you tomorrow." That answer told Zoe more than he intended, because surprise was inconvenient only when someone needed time to finish removing the evidence. She climbed the stairs without taking off her coat, hearing Harold follow at a respectful distance, while the estate seemed to hold its breath around them. The master bedroom looked untouched until she reached the closet, where every dress, shoe, photograph, and personal object had disappeared from the shelves. The room had been cleaned so thoroughly that even the cedar scent of her grandmother's blanket was gone, replaced by fresh polish and the faint perfume Margaret favored. On the center shelf sat a framed photograph of Adrian beside Evelyn Shaw, the daughter of a family whose company had been negotiating with Sterling Capital for months. Both were smiling at a formal dinner Zoe had never heard about, and on the back, someone had written a date only 6 weeks earlier. Beside the frame rested a draft invitation printed on heavy ivory stock, announcing a December celebration involving the Sterling and Shaw families, although the final line had been left blank where the nature of the event should have appeared. Zoe carried both items downstairs and found Margaret in the sunroom, drinking tea beneath windows overlooking gardens stripped by late autumn. Margaret did not look surprised, but the way her fingers tightened around the cup revealed that Zoe's early return had disturbed a sequence she believed she controlled. "Where are my things?" Zoe asked, keeping her tone steady, because Margaret had always used composure as proof of moral authority. Margaret set the cup down and said the staff had packed everything carefully, adding that no personal property had been damaged or discarded. "That does not answer my question," Zoe replied, while Margaret regarded her with the patient expression one might offer a difficult guest. "The room belongs to my son," she said. "It was time the house reflected the future he has delayed for too long." Zoe placed the photograph and invitation between them. "Is this the future you mean?" Margaret glanced at the picture without embarrassment and explained that the Shaw Alliance could protect several struggling Sterling companies, thousands of employees, and the family's standing with investors. She did not claim Adrian loved Evelyn, which made the conversation colder. She spoke as though love had never been relevant enough to consider. Zoe asked whether Adrian knew about the invitation, but Margaret answered with a carefully shaped sentence about responsibilities he could no longer avoid. Before Zoe could press further, the sound of Adrian's car crossed the courtyard, and Margaret's expression changed for less than a second. It was not guilt that appeared. It was irritation that he had arrived before she had finished persuading Zoe to leave quietly. Adrian entered the sunroom still wearing his charcoal suit, stopped when he saw Zoe, then looked at the invitation in her hand. His confusion seemed real, yet Zoe no longer trusted confusion as evidence of innocence. "What is happening in December?" she asked. Adrian read the invitation, turned it over, and demanded to know where she found it. Margaret rose and said the wording was only preliminary, but Adrian ignored her and crossed the room toward Zoe. "I have never seen this," he said. "Evelyn was at a donor dinner. That photograph means nothing." Zoe wanted to believe him, although the empty closet upstairs remained more persuasive than his face. She removed the scholarship contract from her bag and placed it beside the invitation. "Then maybe you can explain this," she said, opening to a page marked by the university's legal counsel. 2 promised scholarship payments had been delayed, and the university had traced the missing money to a temporary transfer approved through Sterling Capital. Adrian stared at the account numbers, then at the digital signature bearing his name. He admitted signing a batch of financing documents during a flight from London, trusting his executive team to flag anything unusual, Margaret immediately called the transfer a short-term measure, insisting the funds would be restored once the Shaw deal closed. Zoe looked from the forged future on the invitation to the real signature on the transfer and understood that the marriage, the merger, and the missing scholarship money were connected by the same dangerous assumption. Everyone around Adrian believed he could be managed if they controlled what he saw, and Adrian had spent years making that belief reasonable. "Someone needed me gone before I started asking questions," Zoe said, watching Margaret go still. "The question is whether they were protecting this family from me, or protecting themselves from what I might find." Adrian followed Zoe into the garage, where 22 boxes stood in 2 straight lines beneath harsh fluorescent lights. He kept asking her to wait until he understood the transfer, but every request sounded like a man still believing knowledge arrived before consequences. Zoe opened the nearest box and found the blue sweater he borrowed on winter mornings. Folded above a binder of holiday recipes no one else in the family had ever noticed she maintained. Another box contained photographs from 6 years of marriage, including images of Adrian laughing with a freedom he rarely carried into the office. He reached toward her hand, but she stepped away and asked how many documents he had signed without reading, because someone told him they were routine. Adrian answered honestly that there had been too many, then tried to explain the speed of corporate decisions, the overseas flights, and the pressure of keeping thousands of people employed. "And what depended on you slowing down?" Zoe asked. "What depended on you noticing me before someone could pack me into boxes?" Adrian opened his mouth, but no answer could survive the truth inside the question. Zoe removed the house keys and placed them on top of a carton, though she left her wedding ring where it was because she refused to make a permanent choice, while shock still controlled her judgment. She said she would spend the night with Denise, her former mentor in Brooklyn, and contact an attorney in the morning. Adrian offered the penthouse, a company apartment, or any hotel she wanted, but Zoe refused every solution that remained connected to his money. She told him the university records would stay with her until an independent review determined where the scholarship funds had gone. Before she left, Zoe asked Harold whether her grandmother's cedar jewelry case had been packed. Harold hesitated, then admitted Margaret had ordered one personal box moved into the estate office because it supposedly contained Sterling property. Adrian's patience broke at last, and he demanded that his mother open the office immediately. Margaret appeared in the garage doorway and said the case required review before anything left the property, but Zoe knew it held no family heirlooms, only letters, old notebooks, and several foundation documents she had stored there during the organization's early years. When Margaret still refused, Adrian called the head of household security and instructed him to unlock the office. The order shocked everyone less because of its force than because it was the first time Adrian had openly removed authority from his mother inside the home she had controlled for decades. The cedar case sat on a conference table beside 3 folders labeled Foundation Restructuring. Zoe opened the first and found correspondence showing that Margaret and 2 trustees had approved temporary loans from scholarship reserves to cover losses at Sterling Urban Development, a failing subsidiary awaiting rescue through the Shaw deal. The amounts were large enough to delay tuition payments, but small enough to avoid immediate attention inside a family office managing billions. In another folder, Charles Vane, the foundation's senior trustee, had outlined a plan for Zoe to take personal leave before the year-end audit, citing marital stress and poor oversight. The language was bloodless, yet its intention was unmistakable. If questions emerged, Zoe would be presented as an inexperienced director whose emotional instability had disrupted the foundation. Adrian read the documents twice, then asked Margaret whether she understood that restricted scholarship funds could not be borrowed like private family capital. Margaret insisted the money had never left the Sterling network and would have been repaid after the merger. "Students have already been told their tuition is late," Zoe said, showing her an email from Camille Brooks, a nursing student who had postponed enrollment because the foundation missed its deadline. Margaret barely glanced at the message before arguing that one delayed semester could not outweigh thousands of jobs. Zoe watched her and realized Margaret had learned to make cruelty sound responsible by describing every victim as a number. "You do not get to call it a small sacrifice when someone else is the one paying for it," Zoe said. Adrian called the company's general counsel and ordered an outside audit, excluding Margaret and the two trustees from every foundation decision. His lawyer warned that freezing the accounts could alarm investors and destroy the Shaw negotiations. But Adrian replied that concealing the transfers would create a larger disaster. Margaret accused him of risking the company for a misunderstanding, and Adrian answered that the misunderstanding had already packed his wife's belongings, forged a public future, and taken money from students. Zoe listened without relief, because his anger had arrived only after the damage became impossible to ignore. When the call ended, she took the cedar case and one suitcase of essentials, leaving the other boxes untouched until her attorney could arrange their removal. Adrian walked her to the driveway and promised he would uncover everything. Zoe looked at him beneath the first drops of rain and said, "Finding the truth may save your company, Adrian. It does not automatically save us." Denise lived above the Brooklyn Community Center, where Zoe had volunteered during graduate school, and the spare room held little more than a bed, a narrow desk, and shelves crowded with donated books. The simplicity felt merciful after the estate, although Zoe barely slept, waking whenever headlights crossed the ceiling and imagining another decision being made without her knowledge. By morning, her attorney had advised her not to return to the house alone, not to speak publicly, and not to surrender any records until the audit team secured the foundation's files. Denise listened while Zoe explained the transfer, the planned separation narrative, and the forged invitation, then asked why Margaret had needed to remove her so quickly. "You were already being pushed aside," Denise said. "Packing your things in one afternoon was not about dislike. Someone believed you were close to something." The answer emerged in a forgotten notebook inside the cedar case. 2 years earlier, a foundation accountant named Martin Cole had raised concerns about consulting invoices that did not match the work described, and Zoe had written down several account numbers before Adrian's father died, and the family entered months of upheaval. She had asked Martin for copies, but he resigned suddenly after receiving a settlement and stopped returning her calls. The notes were not proof, yet they showed that recent transfers were part of a longer pattern. Zoe located Martin through a former colleague, and he agreed to meet in a busy diner near Penn Station, choosing a table close to the door and keeping his coat on as though he had not decided whether to stay. Martin admitted that several foundation accounts had been used for years to support clinics, food programs, and emergency housing projects created quietly by Adrian's father. The programs were real and helped thousands of people, but the paperwork was deliberately vague because some trustees objected to funding communities they considered politically inconvenient. After Adrian's father died, Margaret continued the projects and hid them from the board, believing discretion protected both the recipients and the Sterling name. The problem worsened when Sterling Urban Development began losing money, and Charles persuaded Margaret to borrow scholarship funds temporarily until the Shaw merger restored cash flow. Martin objected, warning that restricted funds could not be moved without disclosure, but Margaret threatened to close a clinic serving his hometown if he reported the transfers. Zoe asked why he had remained silent for 2 years, and Martin looked at the coffee between his hands before answering. "Because I told myself people would lose medical care if I spoke," he said. "After a while, that stopped being the whole reason. I was scared, and the settlement made fear easier to live with." His honesty made the story more credible than any heroic confession could have. He handed her an email from Charles proposing that the foundation's irregularities be attributed to Zoe once the merger closed. The plan did not require criminal charges at first. It required enough doubt to isolate her, damage her reputation, and pressure her into signing a private settlement. Margaret had agreed to remove Zoe from the estate because prejudice made the plan feel like restoration rather than betrayal. Zoe left the diner carrying evidence that could destroy the people who targeted her, but the truth came attached to innocent lives. If the foundation accounts were frozen without replacement funding, clinics and housing programs would close before regulators finished their work. Denise argued that protecting those programs could not mean protecting the people who had misused them, while Zoe's attorney warned that delaying disclosure might expose her to accusations of concealment. The choice was no longer between silence and revenge. Zoe had to reveal the misconduct while preventing the most vulnerable people from becoming collateral damage in another Sterling crisis. She began calling universities, community foundations, and nonprofit leaders, asking whether they could create an emergency fund before the audit became public. Adrian contacted her that evening and asked to meet at the community center without lawyers or security. He arrived carrying copies of documents bearing Zoe's digital signature, including approvals for payments she had never seen. The audit team believed the forms had been created from credentials assigned to Margaret's office, but the server logs were incomplete. Adrian said the board intended to suspend him for freezing the merger and blamed Zoe for the foundation's losses. He offered to resign immediately, believing his departure might protect her from becoming part of a public fight. Zoe studied him across a folding table, covered in children's art supplies, and understood that resignation would be easier for him than remaining accountable. "Leaving would protect you from seeing what they built around your silence," she said. "Stay, tell the truth, and accept whatever it costs." Adrian looked toward the dark windows, where his reflection appeared beside shelves of donated textbooks and chipped board games. He admitted that he had spent years avoiding conflict with Margaret because she always framed control as sacrifice. He had told himself that patience preserved peace, while Zoe absorbed every insult he refused to confront. "I thought not choosing sides meant I loved you both," he said. Zoe shook her head. "When one person is being harmed, refusing to choose is still a choice." Adrian accepted the words without defending himself, then said he would remain through the board hearing and surrender control if the audit found he had failed his duties. Before he left, Zoe showed him Martin's email. They both understood that the hearing would decide more than who led Sterling Capital. It would decide whose version of Zoe became public first. The week before the hearing stripped away the protections surrounding every Sterling name. Financial reporters began publishing rumors about missing charitable funds. Shaw Holdings withdrew from merger negotiations, and the board suspended Adrian's signing authority until the investigation concluded. Evelyn called Zoe after seeing her photograph in an online article and explained that Margaret had invited her to a donor dinner under the pretense of discussing a museum partnership. Adrian had spoken with her briefly in a crowded room, and the photograph had been cropped to remove everyone else. Evelyn was furious that her family name had been used to create the appearance of an engagement, and she agreed to provide the original image and a statement. Her cooperation removed the most visible lie, but it did not solve the deeper problem of the forged financial records. Zoe spent her days building a temporary coalition to protect students and community programs if Sterling accounts were frozen. Universities extended tuition deadlines, 2 national foundations offered bridge grants, and several clinic directors agreed to share records showing how their funding had been concealed. The work left Zoe exhausted, yet it returned a part of her identity she had slowly surrendered inside the estate. She no longer adjusted every opinion to avoid embarrassing Adrian or provoking Margaret. She made decisions, explained them, and accepted disagreement without treating it as evidence she did not belong. Denise noticed the change before Zoe did and told her that independence was not the absence of fear, it was the refusal to let fear choose on her behalf. Margaret requested a private meeting at the community center and arrived without a driver or assistant. She admitted authorizing the staged invitation, the photograph, and the removal of Zoe's belongings, but denied creating the forged signatures. Charles and Robert Pell, another trustee, had promised that Zoe would receive a generous settlement after stepping down, and that no public accusation would be necessary unless she resisted. Margaret believed the Shaw merger would replace the missing funds, protect the hidden clinics, and prevent Adrian from inheriting a collapsing company. She spoke with less certainty than before, though she still described her actions as emergency measures taken for other people. Zoe placed Camille's delayed tuition email beside Martin's statement. "You keep saying you protected people," she said. "You protected the people whose faces you knew. then charged the cost to people you never had to meet. Margaret looked at the email longer this time, and Zoe saw the first crack in her belief that good intentions could cleanse every method. When Zoe showed her Charles's plan to blame the entire scheme on her, Margaret's composure finally failed. The trustees had intended to remove Adrian after the merger, sell the failing subsidiary to investors connected to their own firm, and leave Zoe carrying the scandal. Margaret had believed she was using them to preserve the family, while they had used her prejudice to make Zoe an easy target. Margaret asked what Zoe wanted, expecting a legal demand or a private settlement. Zoe answered that she wanted truthful testimony at the hearing, including every transfer, every staged document, and every conversation about removing her. Margaret understood immediately that cooperation would end her position in the institutions where she had spent decades building influence. "You are asking me to destroy what my husband left behind," she said. Zoe looked through the classroom window, where volunteers were replacing broken shelves with money the Sterling Foundation had promised months earlier. "Your husband left behind people he wanted to help," she replied. "The reputation was the part you added." Margaret left without promising anything, and Adrian called later to say he had signed an agreement placing his voting shares into an independent trust if the audit found serious negligence. The decision could cost him control of the company, even if investigators cleared him of intentional wrongdoing. Zoe recognized that this was the first apology he had offered, through a consequence he could not reverse. She did not reward him with hope or reassurance. She simply told him the hearing would require honesty without performance. "Do not defend yourself by turning me into the reason you changed," she said. "Tell them what you failed to do." The boardroom was full when the hearing began Friday morning. Charles presented the forged documents with measured regret, describing Zoe as an inexperienced director, overwhelmed by access to family resources. Robert argued that Adrian had become incapable of separating corporate duty from marital loyalty. Zoe waited until they displayed an approval carrying her forged signature, then pointed out that the form used her married surname on a date when the foundation's legal filings still listed her as Zoe Carter. Charles called the discrepancy clerical, but the room shifted when Evelyn entered with the original photograph and Martin followed with his attorney. Federal investigators remained outside, waiting for enough evidence to establish deliberate fraud. Then the door opened once more, and Margaret stepped inside carrying her late husband's private ledger. Margaret did not arrive like a woman seeking redemption. She arrived like someone who had finally understood that the truth would cost more tomorrow than it cost today. Under oath, she admitted continuing the hidden community programs, approving temporary transfers from restricted scholarship accounts, and authorizing the plan to remove Zoe from the estate before the audit. She also testified that Charles and Robert had proposed the false engagement narrative, the forged approvals, and the eventual sale of Sterling Urban Development to investors tied to their own partnership. Charles accused her of inventing the story to protect Adrian, but Margaret opened the ledger and identified dates, account numbers, and private meetings recorded in her husband's original system. Martin then produced emails matching those entries, while Evelyn confirmed that neither she nor Adrian had known their photograph would be used. The evidence did not absolve Margaret, and she did not ask it to. She explained that she had chosen to believe the trustees because their plan preserved the programs she cared about and removed a daughter-in-law she had never accepted. "They did not force me to dislike Zoe," she said. "They only built a strategy around something I was already willing to do." The admission changed the room because it removed the last shelter of manipulation. Margaret had been deceived, but she had also been useful to the deception. Federal investigators entered before the hearing ended, escorted Charles and Robert from the building, and secured the foundation's financial records. Adrian survived the removal vote, although the independent committee found that his careless delegation and unwillingness to challenge Margaret had enabled years of misconduct. He accepted a one-year suspension as chief executive, surrendered the chairmanship, and placed part of his family shares into an independent trust. Sterling Capital sold the failing development subsidiary, canceled executive bonuses, and restored every scholarship account before the next enrollment deadline. The company lost value, Several directors resigned, and commentators called Adrian either reckless or principled, depending on which network employed them. For the first time, he stopped shaping decisions around how they would be interpreted and accepted that accountability often looked unimpressive from the outside. Zoe's name was cleared, yet the public vindication felt smaller than she expected. Reporters asked whether she planned to sue Margaret, expose the family in a memoir, or reconcile with Adrian after helping save his company. Zoe declined every invitation to turn private pain into entertainment, and released one statement focused on the students and clinics affected by the transfers. The emergency coalition she built attracted support from universities, nonprofit leaders, and donors who wanted a funding system no single wealthy family could control. Denise encouraged her to establish an independent organization, while Zoe hesitated because she feared building a future entirely around what had been done to her. Martin told her the coalition had succeeded not because people hated the Sterlings, but because they trusted Zoe to protect the mission from them. 6 months later, the Carter Initiative opened above the Brooklyn Community Center with 3 offices, 2 full-time employees, and a legal fund for students whose scholarships disappeared without warning. Zoe hired Martin as compliance director after an outside review, believing that accountability should make room for repair when a person admitted harm without demanding immediate forgiveness. She created a donor policy, preventing any individual or company from controlling more than 10% of the budget. The rule made fundraising slower, but it protected the organization from becoming another monument to someone else's influence. Adrian attended the opening and remained near the back until most guests had left. He told Zoe that he had moved out of the estate, begun therapy, and declined an early offer to return to the board. He did not present these changes as proof he deserved another chance. Instead, he admitted that being busy had allowed him to avoid conflict while still seeing himself as a good husband. Zoe appreciated the honesty, but she had already filed for divorce after the investigation ended. Adrian signed without contest and asked only whether she believed their marriage had been real. "Yes," Zoe said. "That is why I cannot pretend what happened was small." Margaret sent a handwritten apology that contained no gifts, explanations, or requests for reconciliation. She wrote that fear had made her controlling. Privilege had protected that control, and Zoe had carried consequences Margaret never intended to face herself. She offered a Brooklyn property for the initiative's expansion, but Zoe returned the deed because accepting it would violate the donor policy. She suggested placing the building into an independent community trust instead. Margaret followed the recommendation quietly, and the property became a clinic without the Sterling name on its entrance. 3 years after the day her belongings were packed, Zoe stood inside the national headquarters of the Carter Initiative in Washington, watching volunteers prepare classrooms for students arriving from across the country. The restored brick building included legal clinics, mentoring offices, emergency housing, and a scholarship center designed to release funds within 48 hours when another institution failed. Nothing carried Zoe's portrait, although one wall displayed handwritten notes from people describing the moment someone had believed in them before success made belief convenient. She often read those notes before difficult meetings, because they reminded her that the organization existed to create choices rather than gratitude. That evening, Zoe received the National Council for Educational Leadership's Legacy of Hope Award. Camille introduced her, explaining that the emergency coalition had allowed her to begin nursing school after the Sterling payment failed. She now worked in a trauma unit and mentored students from families where one missed paycheck could end a semester. When Zoe stepped to the podium, she saw Adrian and Margaret seated separately near the back, each holding an ordinary ticket. She did not tell the audience about the closet, the forged invitation, or the marriage, because the story no longer belonged only to the people who caused it. Zoe spoke about systems that praised generosity while hiding the power attached to it. She said help became dangerous when recipients were expected to remain silent, loyal, or grateful enough to ignore harm. Her words were direct rather than polished, and she allowed pauses where an older version of herself might have softened the message. People should not have to lose everything before anyone believes they deserved protection, she said. We built this place so one mistake by someone powerful does not become the end of someone else's future. The applause rose slowly, then filled the room. After the ceremony, Margaret asked to speak with Zoe in the courtyard. She looked older, not from disgrace alone, but from living without the institutions that had once reflected her importance back to her. She explained that the community trust now operated 3 clinics and a women's employment center, then admitted she had once believed remorse should earn restoration. It does not, Margaret said. It only tells you where the work begins. Zoe recognized the change because Margaret did not ask to be welcomed back into her life. When she asked whether Zoe had forgiven her, Zoe answered that forgiveness had freed her from carrying the injury every day, but it had not erased the boundary created by it. Margaret accepted the answer without argument. Adrian waited beneath a dogwood tree near the entrance, holding the antique fountain pen Zoe had purchased in Chicago. Harold had found it in the estate office after the investigation, still wrapped inside the original box. Adrian offered it to her, saying it had always belonged to the moment she intended to come home. Zoe looked at the pen, then asked him to keep it. "The man I bought it for is gone," she said. Adrian gave a small, tired smile. "I hope he is." During his suspension, he had chosen not to return as chief executive and now managed the independent trust created from his surrendered shares. His life carried less status than before, yet he spoke without checking the room for approval. They walked toward the headquarters without discussing reconciliation. Adrian told her he had donated the contents of the garage boxes to families rebuilding after eviction, except for her grandmother's letters and several photographs. Zoe accepted the letters but left the photographs with him. "Some of those days were good," she said. "I do not need to make them false just because we could not stay married." Adrian nodded, and the silence between them no longer demanded an answer. The following morning, Zoe entered her office before sunrise and opened a walnut wardrobe standing against the wall. Inside hung a single wooden hanger Harold had mailed at her request years earlier. She had kept it not as proof of humiliation, but as a reminder that empty space could become either an absence or an invitation, depending on who had the right to fill it. She placed her coat on the hanger, closed the door, and turned toward the first grant application waiting on her desk. Outside, students crossed the courtyard, carrying notebooks, coffee cups, and the nervous energy of people arriving somewhere they had worked hard to reach. Denise entered with 2 folders and warned that national recognition had not reduced the paperwork. Zoe laughed, opened the first file, and began reading as the building came alive around her. The closet Margaret emptied had never contained Zoe's place in the world. It had only revealed how much of that world she was capable of building.